Lecture 3, Ethics and Ethical Decision Making. All right, I'm going to try my best Mark Twain here. Are you ready?
Always do right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest.
Okay, so what is right and what is wrong? In our life's experiences, we have all seen at times a whole lot of gray between what looks to be right and wrong. This is a lecture in ethics, and ethics are concerned with how a person should behave and how to show that there are ways of critically analyzing what might be the correct decision given a current fact situation, as it's known in ethics. What did he say? The correct decision given a current situation? Does that mean that decisions of ethics are based upon the situation presented? Well, the short answer is, yeah, maybe. Nice, huh? Well, let's romp through some bad juju wherein folks ended up on the wrong side of maybe. This is from the New York Times. So in 2005, Bernard Ebbers was convicted of fraud and conspiracy as a result of WorldCom's false financial reporting. The WorldCom scandal was, until the Bernie Madoff schemes that came to light in 2008, the largest accounting scandal in the United States history. So Bernie here, gosh, it's Bernard Madoff and Bernard Ebbers. Well, anyway, this Bernie is currently serving 25-year prison term. So this one comes from Wikipedia. I think I did a little more searching than that, but here's Dennis Kozlowski. He's a former CEO of Tyco International. He was convicted in 2005 of crimes related to his receipt of $81 million in unauthorized bonuses, the use of company money to purchase art for $14.75 million for himself, and in falsifying business records for a payment by Tyco of $20 million worth of investment banking fees to a guy by the name of Frank Walsh, who was a former Tyco director. And so Dennis here is also serving 25 years in the federal pen. So this is Darlene Druyan. She's a civilian working for the Air Force, and she sent the resumes of her daughter, a recent college grad, and her daughter's fiance, who was a PhD aeronautical engineer. She sent these to Boeing Aerospace, and they were both hired. Now, Boeing was one of the contractors she procured services from, so this is a big-time conflict of interest and favoritism, kind of a quid pro quo sort of thing. So then after leaving the Air Force, she takes a job with Boeing at an annual salary of $250,000, and she also received a $50,000 bonus. So she got busted. 9 months in prison, $5,000 fine, 150 hours of community service. That's about a month's worth of community service. And honestly, it's pretty light given everything that happened. And on top of that, she's still going to get her federal pension. So, I mean, she hasn't landed too roughly. But here's the deal, right? With all these folks, just when did they cross the line? Did they have that pang of what they should and shouldn't do and somehow just justify their tiny little shouldn't? And what makes us different? What circumstances in our lives have we dealt with where we maybe also felt that little pang of shouldn't, but did it anyway? Is there a fine line between ethical behavior and unethical behavior? In fact, the answer is a resounding, yeah, maybe. Yeah, all right, so I'm a big hockey fan, I admit it. I enjoy the sport. I played on numerous teams and in various leagues. I can tell you that something way deep down gets stirred when you play a rigorous sport like hockey. Dare I say something quite Neanderthal kicks in. And it's got to be something about two warring tribes armed with clubs chasing around a black rabbit. I mean, and in well-played hockey, there aren't many stoppages. There's no downs. There's few pauses for penalties, and there's really no chance to decompress. It simply builds up. In this play, man, you can really get your dander up and things can get pretty freaking spirited. And I think it's human nature. But what about the fans watching that are not on the ice? What is their reasoning for hauling off and smacking someone? They aren't out there directly competing, are they? Is there a proximate cause? And this is a legal term. A proximate cause is an event which is closest to or immediately responsible for causing some observed result, is sitting there watching a hockey game, a proximate cause that would justify a fight breaking out in the stands. Now, many of us have seen pictures like these, or maybe even have experienced them firsthand. And there are corollaries in business, right? I mean, think of the folks that worked for our now jailed trio. Did their staff, like the fans at a hockey game, begin to emulate what they saw happening on the corporate version of the ice? Did these leaders set unethical play in motion, or load the probabilistic dice, as I'll call it, in favor of unethical behavior? I'm going to guess maybe. Dr. Gellerman, who was a renowned industrial psychologist, wrote, "The idea that an action is not really wrong is an old issue. How far is too far? Exactly where is the line between ethical and unethical behavior?" And here I'll ask as well, how about between profit maximization and unethical conduct? Look, ambitious managers will always try to find ways to attract favorable attention, or as Dr. Gellerman writes, to distinguish themselves from other people. Some may see that it is not difficult to look remarkably good in the short term by avoiding things that only pay off in the long run. We have probably all seen folks get promoted on the basis of great short-term results, leaving the unfortunate successors to inherit the resulting mess. Is leaving a mess behind unethical? Maybe, right? The bottom line here for Gellerman is that if you put enough people in an ambiguous, ill-defined situation, that some will conclude that whatever hasn't been labeled specifically wrong must be okay, especially if they are rewarded for certain acts. Yikes, you say, really? Yeah, you betcha. Okay, so now there are laws and rules out there that do specifically codify stuff as legally wrong. And here are a few on this page, right? These laws and others are considered a recognition that human nature is what it is, and that rules are needed to protect us from ourselves. And as we saw back in 2007, 2009, right, the rules in place at the time were not enough to keep us from the Great Recession. Ultimately, the focus here is to construct an effective set of rules and establish punishment for violation of those rules. As Dr. Gellerman puts it, the goal is not to increase the severity of punishment, but rather to heighten the perceived probability of being caught in the first place. So, where does that leave us? Well, let me see if I can help with some of these maybes. There is a place for reason here in ethical thought. We have the ability to arrive at options that can and do represent reasonable choices. Now, our book talks about three major ethical theories: utilitarianism, universalism, and virtue. The authors talk about these as ethical lenses. Now, I'm more of a good pastor convert, and that's what I'm going to use here for the rest of this lecture. Now, Ken Goodpaster, in his landmark 1983 Harvard Business School paper entitled "Some Avenues for Ethical Analysis in General Management," makes a case for what I call three legs of the ethical stool. Not lenses, but legs. Namely, utilitarianism, contractarianism, and pluralism. That's a mouthful, huh? The reason I see them as legs is that every choice we make in business management and leadership is best supported by resting upon each of these three legs. Rest upon only two, and the stool falls. He goes on to write that the utilitarian message is that moral common sense is to be governed by a single dominant goal, and that this is maximizing net expected utility for all parties affected by a decision or action. So one could rephrase that to include maximizing happiness or pleasure, maximizing preference, welfare, profit. The key here is that it includes all parties affected. However, you can see rather quickly that standing on this leg alone, that could cause some trouble. Now think of northern Michigan, where lumber was once king. Lumber barons and employees of the lumber companies maximized their happiness through profit and lifestyle by clear-cutting centuries-old trees. But once the trees were gone, towns went bust. The land left barren. In hindsight, was that a good call? And here's where the next leg of the stool comes in: contractarianism. The central theme here is that moral common sense is to be governed not by utility maximization, but by fairness. Ken goes on to explain that fairness is a condition that prevails when all individuals are accorded equal respect as participants in social arrangements. In short, this reflects the rights of individuals to veto in a way that utilitarianism does not. However, wedged into this avenue is the argument of tolerance versus individual liberties, economic versus social progress. Yep, we can see some tension here. And the final leg of this three-legged stool is pluralism. The governing ethical idea here is the idea of duty. The pluralistic viewpoint focuses on the rightness or wrongness of actions as moral qualities that are distinct from consequences or rights. Pluralistic reasoning in general management is reflected by principle, such as honesty, integrity, consistency, those sorts of things, right? Ultimately, the pluralistic avenue defines some actions are just wrong. Okay, so armed with these, let's talk about some real-life examples and apply these avenues of critical thinking to case studies. For the next series of slides, when the slide comes up, hit the pause button and read the case. Follow the instructions listed here on this slide. And once you've written down a sentence for each of the ethical legs of the stool, take a moment and consider if the person or organization made an ethical choice. Then, and only then, are you allowed to hit the play button to hear my answer. And remember, man, no cheating. Be ethical about this, all right? Okay, so you might want to hit the pause button now so you can go get yourself a pen and paper and write these instructions down. No, really, hit the pause button. Pen, paper, write this stuff down. Now, 3, 2, 1, pause. Okay, let's get started. So the first case is alliance agreements with suppliers. Now I'm about to give my answer. If you haven't paused yet, then pause. Stop. All right. So here comes my answer. Utilitarianism, which is goal-based, right? Well, this certainly did help GE's bottom line. Contractarianism, which is rights-based. So if you do not agree with GE's alliance agreement, does this mean that you are then at a competitive disadvantage? Well, it sounds a bit like extortion, and I would say that that's really not fair. In fact, this is considered a kickback. You really don't want to be part of any kind of deal like this. Remember what happened to Darlene. And then pluralism, which is duty-based. Okay, so the quid pro quo, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours rule of thumb might say that, well, yeah, this seems like it's okay, right? So you got 2 out of the 3, but contractarianism fails. That leg of the stool fails, and therefore the stool falls, and the conduct is considered not ethical. Right? So that's how this thing works, right? We're going to take each case, write a sentence down, and see if each of the legs hold up. All right, let's go on to the next one. So this one's about relationships with family members. Utilitarianism, goal-based. Okay, so this certainly helps both Mark's company and Mark's cousin's bottom line. Contractarianism, rights-based. So if Mark agrees, does he preferentially help his cousin at the peril of other suppliers? This steps into something that is considered a conflict of interest. Pluralism, duty-based. Okay, I get the whole family first thing, and from his family's point of view, his aunt and uncle will be super happy that he's helping out his little cousin. But across town, some other purse maker's family may be suffering from this preferential treatment. Is that right? This doesn't exactly fail the contractarianism leg of the stool. There is a potential conflict of interest here, though, when a family member has a significant interest in any business transaction of your company. Most companies require that all such potential conflicts of interest must be disclosed to the company's human resource department. Doing so will allow what I call daylight to shine on the question. In ethics, daylight is the best disinfectant. So in this case, Mark notified HR and his supervisor in materials management, right? It was decided to move Ellen's contract negotiation to one of Mark's colleagues to assure that Mark did not get caught in a conflict of interest. So here the stool stands, and Mark gets to sit proudly on this ethical stool. So here's a case regarding the sale of company stock, and you'll hear about these in the news every once in a while. Okay, utilitarianism, goal-based. Well, Jane and her husband certainly maximized their utility on this one by having inside information. On the surface, insider trading is when someone uses their position or profession to obtain information that's not known to the public, and then acts on that knowledge to trade on the markets for a profit. In our case, the insider Jane shares the information with her husband, and then he makes 2 trades based on that information. Their gains are considered ill-gotten profits. But wait a minute, was anybody really harmed? Wasn't it just someone who was better informed and able to take advantage of an opportunity? I mean, no one really loses money, right? The company will do well regardless of who owns what shares. And finally, the unknowing public will still get their opportunity to invest just the same once the information goes public. So no harm, no foul, right? No, wrong. Recall the definition that utilitarianism requires maximizing net expected utility for all parties affected. And while Jane and her husband maximize their profit, buying shares can increase the share price so the next party does not get the same sale price. And now, this is where the next leg of the ethical stool comes in. Contractarianism, rights-based. First, was the person who sold their stock position to Jane's husband treated fairly? And the easiest way to ask this question is this. If the seller had the same inside information, would he have sold their position? Insider trading isn't simply fair in a free market. It's not fair when an individual gets a jump start on a great investment opportunity because of their position, while the average investor is limited to trusting whatever information eventually comes public. Now finally, pluralism, duty-based. Insider trading has been deemed wrong, and it's codified into law. It's one of those things that can actually get you sent to prison. I mean, just ask Martha Stewart. So she avoided a loss of $45,000 by selling about 4,000 shares of her ImClone system stock back in 2001, after she got some, non-public material information. And for that, she spent 5 years in the federal prison and paid in excess of $200,000 in restitutions and fines. So ultimately, Jane's loose lips wasn't in itself unethical, but when she and her husband executed the stock trades, they crossed the line. All right, so this one's about charitable work, and maybe we'll actually answer the question, is it true that no good deed goes unpunished? Utilitarianism, goal-based. Here we have competing goals. Rob's goal to become more politically active versus his company's goal to obtain a fully engaged employee given Rob's remuneration. It sounds like Rob knows up front that he will not be able to give his all at work if he pursues this political agenda. Contractarianism, which is rights-based. By Rob using company time to pursue his outside interests, he is not treating his company fairly. And then pluralism, duty-based. In this case, it is wrong to use company time to pursue non-business activities. It can be considered misuse of company assets and constitutes fraud. So what seemed like an innocuous personal choice ends up failing all 3 ethical legs of the stool. Yet we see this happen more often than we'd like to admit, and our next case will show that. Okay, so personal use of corporate property, and this can often end up to be quite the mess. So let's break it down. Break it down. Utilitarianism, goal-based. So here again we have competing goals. Steve is attempting to maximize his work effectiveness, and Sue is attempting to maximize her pleasure. Recall again, too, the definition of utilitarianism. That requires maximizing net expected utility for all parties affected. One additional party to this is Acme, who is in good faith paying Sue to work and not play games. Contractarianism, which is rights-based. And Sue may feel that her right to privacy and pursuit of happiness has been, well, crushed. However, the person who has not been treated fairly has been Steve. Steve has not been treated fairly by Sue because She has put personal pleasure ahead of Steve's desire to perform well. And for the company Acme, right? And Acme is paying both of them to perform well. Steve has also not been treated fairly by his boss, who ratted him out. Now, there is a case to be made that Steve didn't treat Sue fairly, as he went to his boss prior to speaking with her first. Now, he might have spoken to her about the problem, but we don't really know that. It's not presented as part of the facts. And finally, pluralism, duty-based. As in the previous case, it is wrong to use company time to pursue non-business activities. It can be considered a misuse of company property and constitutes fraud. So as in the previous case, what seemed like an innocuous personal choice ends up failing all three ethical legs of the stool. All right, so our final case, has to do with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, also known as the FCPA. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is an act that forces U.S. companies to comply with U.S. norms and ethics, independent of what might be considered locally ethical. So while the analysis we're about to undertake is based upon normative ethics, U.S. normative ethics, a Mulvaney official might have different opinions. In fact, bribery, which this is about, is often an acceptable business practice in many countries and regions. Okay, here we go. Utilitarianism, goal-based. This arrangement certainly enriches Butler's company, it enriches the Mulvaney oil concern, and the hired agent, and maybe even the shareholders of Drill Company Incorporated. On the face, all parties directly affected see maximized utility. However, as we shall see, a law is broken, and as such, competing law-abiding U.S. companies who could be considered affected parties will be at a disadvantage. Contractarianism, rights-based. So on its face, call it prima facie, it seems like no one's rights have been violated. But on a wider scale, though, corrupt business practices such as bribes put lawful competitors at a disadvantage, and that violates their right to fair trade. Pluralism, duty-based. In this case, U.S. federal law has codified this business practice as wrong, and it's also considered a punishable crime. So now it's claimed that the FCPA has put U.S. companies at a competitive disadvantage. And yeah, many countries consider bribes just a part of doing business. So here's some figures, right? The top country where bribery is engaged, 75% of the people in Liberia and Yemen, the population engages in bribery. In Sierra Leone, it's 84% of the population. But the problem is more widespread because many European countries, many Northern European countries also see this as the cost of doing business. While the EU has a patchwork of laws, only the UK in 2011 passed a comprehensive anti-bribery law equivalent to the FCPA. So yes, the US has been and still is at a competitive disadvantage regarding bribery. We are applying our ethical standards to international business dealings, and sometimes, well, that ends us up on the short end of the stick.
Introspection, which is also known as self-observation, self-analysis, soul-searching, it's a way of taking stock of your own mental and emotional processes and your own motivations. Introspection is an important part of ethical behavior. It's where common sense and virtue can help guide you. If something seems unethical, well, it probably is. But what is the next step to take? Do you rush to your boss or to HR and complain like Steve did regarding Sue? Maybe not. Often the first best step is to discuss the issue right up front with your colleague or associate. Start to crack open the daylight on the subject. You may simply have misunderstood the situation. And if you did understand the situation correctly, then you've taken a great first step in the ethical disinfecting process. Recall, it is always best to get the facts, to go to Genba, the scene of the crime that we talked about in the last lecture, and to avoid assumptions. But then if the answer you receive doesn't satisfy, then yes, it's time to take the next step.
Okay, so for our lecture 3, call to action. What's right and what's wrong? Well, that depends. Often the choices we make as leaders and managers are picked up on as okay by the folks we lead. So we do have a responsibility to act and lead ethically. And lead by example. Don't leave folks in ethically ambiguous situations. Remember, too, that one of the best ethical disinfectants is daylight. Discuss the problem. Bring it to light. And I've left you with a powerful set of tools from Ken Goodpasture of Harvard to check and see if your ethical stool stands. Feel free to use them. You'll be using them in your homework assignment. And finally, if you're not sure if that little nagging shouldn't alarm is ringing, then listen to it. Feel free to ask and seek guidance before you act.